So, welcome to our EM service. We're glad you are here. Today, we are continuing our last unit of Creation and Covenant. And today's message title is Two Peoples Will Come From You, out of Genesis 25 and 27. So, if you can all stand, we're going to read the word of the Lord out loud together today. The blue slide is you and I together. The green slide is just me. There's 6 slides. We'll go back and forth to read out loud together in just 1 second. All right. Okay, here we are. Genesis 25, verse 19. All together, ready? Begin. This is the account of the family of Isaac, the son of Abraham. When Isaac was 40 years old, he married Rebekah. Isaac pleaded with the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was unable to have children. The Lord answered Isaac's prayer, and Rebekah became pregnant with twins. But the 2 children struggled with each other in her womb. So she went to ask the Lord about it. Why is this happening to me, she asked. And the Lord told her, the sons in your womb will become 2 nations. From the very beginning, the 2 nations will be rivals. One nation will be stronger than the other, and your older son will serve your younger son. Okay, ready? Begin. And when the time came to give birth, Rebekah discovered that she did indeed have twins. The first one was very red at birth and covered with thick hair like a fur coat, so they named him Esau. Then the other twin was born with his hand grasping Esau's heel, so they named him Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when the twins were born. As the boys grew up, Esau became a skillful hunter. He was an outdoorsman, but Jacob had a quiet temperament, preferring to stay at home. Isaac loved Esau because he enjoyed eating the wild game Esau brought home, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Ready? One day, when Jacob was cooking some stew, Esau arrived home from the wilderness, exhausted and hungry. Esau said to Jacob, I'm starved. Give me some of that red stew. All right, Jacob replied, but trade me your rights as the firstborn son. Look, I'm dying of starvation, said Esau. What good is my birthright to me now? Last one all together. Ready? Begin. But Jacob said, first you must swear that your birthright is mine. So Esau swore an oath, thereby selling all his rights as the firstborn to his brother Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau some bread and lentil stew. Esau ate the meal, then got up and left. He showed contempt for his rights as the firstborn. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. So, how many of you have at least one sibling? Okay? Majority of you guys, actually almost everybody here, has at least one sibling, maybe more, okay? What was your relationship like with them growing up? I see some laughter. I see some, okay? What was it like for you with your sibling growing up? Were you firstborn? Were you secondborn, thirdborn, fourthborn? I don't think it was fourthborn here, but what was it like for you growing up with your siblings? What was it like on the best of days? And what was it like on the worst of days? And how has that impacted the way you've grown up to become today? So most of you guys know I have a younger brother. We are only like 20 months apart, 2 years in grades. Obviously, I'm the firstborn, right? Like the personality fits right now for a firstborn. My brother is typical secondborn Korean boy. Only boy in the household, but secondborn. We fit that bill to a T, okay? So you guys know I was a Kim. My maiden name is Kim. There are a million Kims in the world, okay? But my grandma and grandpa, which we're very close to, they kind of raised us when we were growing up. So my grandpa was the only son, which at that time was kind of rare because they had a lot of kids during that generation. So he was the only child and the only son. And so my grandma married into that family, and there was all this pressure for her because she grew up in like Korean War generation. So like they went through that time, okay? So they went through the time where like the daughter-in-law would move into the the husband's house, and she could never eat at the same table as the rest of the family. Like she ate in the kitchen. Like that was the culture at that time. Like really, really traditional, really strict. And so she had a really hard time. But she did her duty and gave birth to 3 sons. Okay? My dad's the middle son. And a daughter daughter, son. So we immigrated to the States, and we're obviously Korean American. So we have kind of a different like cultural like spin to us. But My grandma would always say growing up that, so my brother is the only Kim son. So daughter had 3 children, but she's not a Kim, right? Oldest son had 3 daughters. Youngest son had 2 daughters. Then I came along, and everyone's scared that there's only going to be girls. And my grandma's like, no, I worked too hard to have 3 sons. There will be a son. So my brother was that son that came along. That was the only Kim son in our whole family. And so my grandma used to always say growing up, she'd be like, oh, I love you, because she raised us, so we're very close to her. And she'd be like, oh, my Korean name, she'd be like, oh, Choronga, when I die, I'm going to give you this much because I love you so much. You're my favorite grandchild. But when your brother dies, I'm going to give him this much because he's the boy, so he gets double. And that's what she would always say to me. And I remember being like, that is so unfair. Literally, I am better than him in every account, okay? And so that's kind of how I was born. I was like really ambitious, really intense. I was like straight A student, like everything honors, everything president. I was like really, really intense. But in hindsight, I think I became that way because I felt really inferior to my brother. Like, really? Just because I'm a girl, like, I get nothing? And so I was like, I'm gonna show them, So I was like really, really motivated and very ambitious growing up. But because we're so close in age, we went to school together. So he had all my teachers. And what he hated was that I was this huge shadow. And he hated getting my teachers. Because they'd be like, oh my gosh, you're Stacy's brother. You must be so smart. He's actually smarter than me. But he didn't care for school. And so he would not do well. And he hated being in my shadow. And I hated that he was just better for being a boy. And so we had this love-hate relationship growing up. Sometimes through teenage years, it was more not good relationship. And we were always just had this contention between us growing up. And actually it was only because I went to college and I met Jesus that our relationship got healed, honestly. It was because of that reason. And he met Jesus. He went to the mission field, met Jesus. I went to college, met Jesus. And that's literally why our relationship was healed. When we joke that when we don't see each other as often now because he lives on the East Coast and we live here. But when we do see each other, and if it's for longer than a week, we joke, we're like, okay, we're done. You gotta go back, I gotta go back. Our old 10-year selves are coming out, we're done right now. But we had a hard relationship growing up, and it was only because of Jesus, truly, that our relationship was healed. And this story, the story of Jacob and Esau is very close to me because I literally see myself through Jacob very much all the time. I feel like this is my story, in my own application way. But the story of Jacob and Esau is really fascinating because what we see is that this is the promised family of God, right? Why is this family so important? It's not just about Abraham's favored. It's because God had promised from the very beginning, through a family, the Messiah will come. Through Eve's offspring, Messiah will come. And so that means one family gets picked, and that was Abraham's. And so Abraham, down to Isaac last week, and now down to the next generation. And so here we are, this promised family of God. You better believe that Jacob and Esau grew up hearing often about how they are the promised family of God, that God spoke to their grandfather, and the line now carries on through them. You better believe they heard that all the time. And so here they are in this story. Here we go in verse 19. Isaac, son of Abraham, 40 years old, Rebekah. Now, there is a common theme here that we're already seeing between every generation. Why are they having a hard time having kids? Hard time having kids. And yet, Abraham took matters into his own hands with Hagar and Ishmael. But here, Isaac proves to be different from his father. And he pleaded with God on behalf of his wife, and so he answered his prayer. And she became pregnant with twins. Now, at that time, they don't have ultrasounds or doctors. She has no idea what's going on in her belly, okay? But here they are in verse 22. Can you imagine 2 children struggling in your womb? One of my best friends from college recently, about a year ago, gave birth to 2 identical twin boys, okay? She is like a chopstick. That's how skinny she is. She's very tall, very skinny. And her belly was 2 boys big. And she would say, I mean, it was sometimes crazy in there. Like two boys just going at it, going crazy. But Rebecca's probably also freaking out. Like, what in the world is going on in here? But here we see Rebecca goes to God with that question. She's like, hey, God, what's going on? Like, I don't know. No one else knows, but only you know what's happening to me. And so the Lord actually speaks to her directly. And he gives her this like prophetic word, this word of, even though these children are not yet born, they have not breathed a single breath earthside, they have not had a chance to even be named, and yet God already knows exactly what will happen to these two. And he's saying, 2 sons, 2 nations, they will be rivals. One will be stronger than the other, and actually, the older one will serve the younger. Have you guys ever met like Korean twins, like Korean twins? So, you know, like twins are born like minutes apart, right? Like maybe max 10 minutes, but really it's like just a few minutes apart. And so if you ever meet Korean twins, because Koreans, you know, hierarchy is really important. So even if it's 2 twin girls, for example, the second born twin, who's only 5 minutes younger, will call the other twin 언니. 언니 is what you call like older sister, or like 오빠 or hyung. Like that's what they will do. So even though they literally were womb mates, like shared the womb together, they were born around the same time, they will still call the older one, because the older one was born first. In that same way, in the culture here, in Jewish culture, very similar. Firstborn son, the birthright is that you are now the head of the house, and you get double portion your father's inheritance. So if Jacob has this much, and he has 2 sons, he'll actually break it into 3 and give 2 portions to Esau and 1 portion to Jacob. Just because Esau was born 10 minutes earlier, or whatever it was, you know? So that's how it was very strong. The hierarchy was very strong in that time. And so we see here that God does what is very countercultural and very unexpected. And he actually puts the younger one above the older one. That is very unusual for that time and not what they would have done. And yet Rebecca hears this word exactly from God. So here we see this interesting balance of God's sovereignty, who knows all things. From the minute that you were conceived in your mother's womb, before she even knew she was pregnant with you, God already knew exactly your life and destiny. You sitting here right now, God knew that from the moment you were conceived. God knows all things and has a plan for all things. Now, that's important to keep in mind because that ends up being the anchor to the story. God always had a plan to put Jacob above Esau, and there's a reason why, which we'll come to see. But we also see Jacob and Esau's free will coming into play in the story and how they took what was God's plan and made it happen their own way. That's the most critical piece that we have to pull away and learn from. Because here we are now in verse 24. When the time came to give birth, Rebecca discovered that, thank goodness, it is actually twins. I'm not going crazy. The first one was red, and so they named him Esau. Esau actually means red, okay? And then the other twin was born grasping Esau's heel, okay? First of all, do any of you guys know how birth happens, okay? Usually, what comes out first? What's supposed to come out first when you give birth? The head, the baby's head, crown, okay? The baby's head comes out first. If the baby's butt comes out first, it is not good, or feet, it is not good. Baby can actually die that way, okay, coming out. So head first is really, really important. That's how they survive, okay? Head, and then the rest of them comes out, okay? So Esau came out. But can you imagine this baby comes out, Esau comes out, and then literally Jacob is grabbing onto his heel to be like, get back in here. I'm going to go back out first. Like, that's what he was, poor Rebecca. That's what he was doing, okay? His hand actually came out first. It was so significant that he did that they named him Jacob, which means heel catcher, heel grasper, the one who grasps the heel. It was because that is not normally how babies are born. Babies are not born like this, but he was. Because he was grabbing onto his heel almost like, I will not be second. But he was. So significant that they named him Jacob. And Jacob actually also translates to a meaning that's deceiver, trickster. That's what his name actually means. But it was so significant that they named him that he was born in that way. Names are very significant in this time. And ironically enough, we'll see him grow up to live up to his name, sadly enough. Next passage, verse 27. So as the boys grew up, Esau became a skilled hunter, and Isaac preferred and loved Esau for his own reasons. He loved him, right? Enjoyed the wild game, firstborn son, like man's man, like, you know what I mean? That's what he was. And Jacob was loved by his mother. In other words, he was a sweet, sweet mama boy at home, okay? That's what he was. But Rebekah probably also loved and preferred him because she knew the word that God had told her when she was pregnant with them, that Jacob would actually be the one that Abraham's promise would flow through. She knew that. So she probably had her own reasons for loving Jacob also. But here's the thing. As each parent loved one child more than the other, it actually caused this really awful sibling rivalry between them. These boys were never, ever close. They were not companions. They might be born in the same womb, but they were not close. And so this favoritism leads to this sibling rivalry. It actually ends up destroying the family for quite some time. There are big ramifications to this. Remember, this is the promised family of God. If you were God, you'd be like, this family is crazy. Like, why would I pick this family? They're not worthy of having this calling. And yet this is the family he chose. In the same way that he chose each of us to be a part of his family. I'm pretty sure that even on the worst of days for each of us, we are not as bad as Jacob and what he continues to do the rest of his life. So what does that tell us about us? That in God's family, he truly has quite a bit of room for variety in who we are and what we bring, and what he forgives and what he works with. Every one of us, he brings into his family. Because look at this family. There's a lot going on. So, now the boys are grown, okay? And here we are in verse 29. This is the first of two major events that sets this family to start dividing and breaking apart. So here is Jacob. He's cooking. Esau comes home starved. Who in this room would you agree that when you get hungry, you also get angry? Okay? If you are hungry, you also get angry, which I love to call hangry. Okay? I am guilty of being hangry. My husband knows if I'm getting a little snappy, he's like, let's just feed you, and then everything is better, okay? So Esau is like hangry to the hangriest. He is so upset, so hangry, so hungry. And so he comes in. He's like, give me the stew. And here's Jacob, okay? Here's what he says. Okay, but trade me your right as the firstborn son. See, you don't just come up with that off the fly. Okay? You don't just like, I'm cooking like, that'd be a good trade. No, that you don't just think of that on the spot. Jacob has been harboring this resentment for being just a few minutes behind for the majority of his life. He's been harboring this like, what can I do so that I can actually get the birthright? So that I can be the one to get double portion. All his life, he's probably been scheming and thinking about the very best opportunity. And so when the time comes, he seizes it to the max. Can you imagine? Okay, like, if your father was a multimillionaire and you knew that you were the main inheritor of that fortune, and you're so hungry that your younger sibling has pizza, and you trade a box of Domino's pizza for a multi-million-dollar inheritance? Like, does that make sense? It does not make sense at all. But what it shows is that Esau did not take his birthright very seriously. He did not care for it the way that he should have. He did not think it as highly as he should have. To him, the immediate satisfaction of not being hungry anymore, that was more important to him than the long-term vision of what God had called him to as the firstborn. And so they're both at fault in the story here. Jacob gets a bad rep, and he's not great. He shouldn't have done that, right? We can see his scheming, deceptive, ambitious part of him taking over. So that he was at fault. But also Esau was also at fault because he should not have taken it that lightly. We see that he has this very flippant attitude towards God's promises for his family. Just whatever, take it for granted. Have you seen, they actually say that people who are wealthy, riches to rags, or rags to riches stories, that's the first generation. Second generation grew up watching their parents kind of struggle, and so they really take their inheritance seriously. But it's the third generation that often does not, because they're born into wealth. And so they have no idea how hard it was to earn that. And so they say if a company or whatever can last past the third generation, it has longevity. But it's usually at the third generation where it kind of breaks, where it kind of falls apart. This is third generation right here, Jacob and Esau. And so they're both not great. They both don't do very well here. And so in verse 33, Jacob said, "Swear to me your birthright." And so Esau swore, which in that day, that was blood oath. It was done deal. And so he traded his firstborn rights for a bowl of lentil stew and bread. I mean, he definitely got the short end of the stick there. And yet that's what he did. And so he showed contempt. Contempt meaning he didn't actually care much for what it meant for him to carry on that blessing and that promise in that family. So our main point here today is this, that jealousy and pride, it does lead to destruction, and it does lead to selfish decisions, even in the things of God. They're not here trying to do these worldly things. They are here knowing they're part of God's family, knowing they're called to carry on this great and mighty calling. They're trying to do good things here, right? But even in that, we see jealousy and selfishness and pride begin to corrupt and destroy from the inside out. Now, today is part 1. Next week is part 2. We're going to see how God redeems this story. But here, over and over again, we see jealousy and pride between these two brothers threatens to destroy the family of God from the inside out. We're not done yet, because a few chapters later, Genesis 27, Isaac is old. He's blind. He thinks he's going to die soon. And so he calls Esau and he's like, hey, because the birthright's gone now. Esau's forfeited it, okay? But there's still the father's blessing that's left. The father's blessing is kind of like the parents' last wishes before they die, So we honor last wishes. So even though he's forsaken his birthright, he can at least have his father's blessing before he dies. And so he calls him over. Hey, go, hunt me down something, make me some food, and I'm going to bless you. And so Rebekah hears this, and she calls Jacob over. Now, Rebekah, up until now, has been very faithful. But here we see a different side of her. And she's like, Jacob, guess what I heard? So you go, find me a goat. I'll prepare it just the way your father likes it. You're going to go in and act like you're Esau and take the blessing. Now, Jacob should have been like, that's a bad idea, Mom. But you know what he says? He goes, what if I get caught? What if I get caught? Because Esau's hairy and I'm not. So just by feeling my hand, he will know the difference. Man, how hairy was Esau? Who knows, but really hairy, okay? But so obvious that it would have been obvious. And so they designed this elaborate scheme. She puts Esau's clothes on him, puts goat's fur on him, ties him up to him so that he's hairy. They do this whole charade. He goes in. Isaac actually asks him multiple times, are you Esau? He's like, yeah. So give me the food, and he eats it. Are you Esau? Yeah. Are you Esau? Then like come near. And he catches the smell of Esau on his clothes and he's like, oh, okay, you are my son. And then he blesses Jacob with the blessing he meant for Esau. So then Esau comes back and finds out that Jacob once again has tricked him, deceived him, and taken everything he possibly could have from his father now. And so here we are in verse 36. Esau exclaimed, no wonder his name is Jacob, deceiver, tricker, grabber of my heel, for now he has literally cheated me twice. First, he took my rights as the firstborn, and now he's stolen my blessing. Jacob has lived up his name. Now he can justify it this way. Jacob can say, I was just following my mom's instructions, which is true. Rebecca could have justified it like, I was just following God's plan. Because when I was pregnant, God told me that it was going to be Jacob, which is true. But the reality is they tried to fulfill God's plan by their own selfish ways. I want to repeat that because that's the main point. They're both right. This was what God said. But they took God's plans and wanted to accomplish it in their own ways, the ways that they felt were right. Now, how do we know it wasn't actually a good move? You can always tell by the fruit. When you have a decision to make in your life, right? When you have a choice to make and it's not very clear, and you're like, well, you know what? I think God is telling me this, right? So-and-so thing. The reality is you can know, actually, if it was really God or not based on the fruit of that decision. Now, sometimes there's suffering and there's hard things. That's not a bad thing, right? But look at the fruit of what happened in Rebekah and Jacob and Esau and Isaac's life. In verse 41, we'll see this. From that time on, Esau hated Jacob, hated him. And Esau began to scheme, I will kill my brother as soon as my father is dead. I'm killing him. Rebekah heard this, so she sent for Jacob and told him, get ready and flee to Laban, my brother. Stay there until your brother cools off. When he calms down and forgets what you have done, I will send for you to come back. Here's the sad reality. Jacob never saw his mother ever again. As the favored son, his favorite parent, he never saw his mother ever again. What did she say? When he cools down, I'll call back for you. We'll see next week what happened. He goes to his uncle's house. He actually ends up spending 20 years there. Can you imagine year after year, he's waiting for his mom to send someone to say to come back home because your brother's forgotten it. But year by year goes by, no word from his family, nothing, which means his brother has not forgotten. His brother has not cooled off from his anger. Literally, Jacob is a wanted man. His brother is willing and wanting to kill him. We may say that Rebekah was just doing what she felt God said was true because the younger one's going to be bigger than the older one, right? We can justify all we want. Now, that is true. But the fruit of what they did was not good. The whole family divided. Jacob, for 20 years away from his family. Rebekah dies before he gets to return back. Literally, God has to intervene in a wrestling match in order to reunite this family. But the fruit was not good. And so, what about you and I? When God's promises are before us, or God's plans are before us, or we're asking for God to do his will in our lives, how much do we trust him versus ourselves? We can say all we want that we trust God, but you will know who you really trust because of what you do and what you say. Just like Jacob and Rebekah. What they did revealed what they really, really were thinking. when the things of God, even with the things of God, how often do we commit sin because of jealousy and pride gets in the way of even doing things for God, serving for God? How many of us say all these things of like, how many of us have church hurt? A lot of us do. Those are things that is not the way God has designed church to be. And yet that's often the reality. Because of jealousy, pride, selfishness, all these things, we hurt each other all in the name of God. Doesn't make any of it right. And yet, God still uses that family to bring forth Jesus. And yet God still uses us to somehow be a witness to our broken world. And so, let me ask you, how much do you trust yourself versus God? And how much do you and I need to repent of the ways that we have given in to jealousy or selfishness or self-protection in the name of church hurt? But in reality, the fruit of it has not been actually very good. And that actually isn't God's best plan for us. Okay, other praise team come up. This is a hard topic because a lot of us do carry a lot of our own baggage in our own spiritual life, in our own spiritual walk. All of us do. And yet, the closer you get to God, the more you will realize that He's calling us to surrender. He's calling us to repent, to come back to Him. Can we all stand, all of us in the room? This is an old song we're going to sing today. Old. And yet, old is some of the best songs because it really truly does speak to our hearts. As we sing this song to close today and worship Him, I pray that we could all come before God in repentance for all the ways that we have allowed jealousy or pride or selfishness or self-protection to keep us away from the plans of God being fully fulfilled in our lives. Yes, I'm not saying that the things that were done against us, because the things that were done to Esau and Jacob were not good. They were not good. And they were both very much hurt. It does not minimize the hurt. But what it does do when we come before Him in repentance is that we can fully walk out the plan that God has for us, which is so much better than anything I could ever do. And so, let us sing this song together as our own prayer before Him.